There comes a moment in world history when a nation once underestimated, once overlooked steps up and speaks truth that echoes across every corridor of global power. That moment just happened. India, with calm clarity and fearless conviction, didn't just call out Trump's double standards. They shattered the mask of American exceptionalism with facts, dignity, and strength. If you believe in truth over theatrics, if you believe in accountability over arrogance, you're about to witness a global mic drop. Let's dive in. There's a certain poetic justice when someone gets beaten at their own game, not with anger, not with insults, but with precision, poise, and truth. That's exactly what happened when India, standing firm on the global stage, held up a mirror to the very man who spent years distorting it, Donald Trump, the same man who turned manipulation into a strategy, who sold nationalism like a carnival trick, was suddenly watching as another nation used that very style, but with soul, with substance, and without lies. Trump's entire appeal has been built on the idea of dominance, project strength, talk loud, frame everyone else as weak, be unapologetic. It worked for a while, didn't it? He bulldozed through decorum, dismissed diplomacy as weakness, and leaned into a style that many mistook for courage. But what he never expected was someone using that same force, but rooted in truth, not ego. India didn't come to that stage with noise. It came with something far more devastating, clarity. With each word, it exposed not just Trump's hypocrisy, but the hollow foundation on which much of his global narrative stands. Think about it. How often did Trump use the phrase national interest as a way to justify every broken alliance, every pulled treaty, every reckless move? And yet, when India spoke of its own national interest, grounded in facts, in regional stability, and historical truth, Trump's entire rhetoric looked like a cheap suit falling apart at the seams. But what really hit hardest wasn't the words, it was the delivery. India didn't need fire to burn Trump's aid. It used ice, calm, collected, factual. It wasn't screaming, it wasn't grandstanding. It was like watching a chess player dismantle someone who only knows how to play checkers. Every time Trump leaned into his go-to tactics, mockery, exaggeration, selective outrage, India simply responded with unshakable confidence. Let's not forget, Trump thrives in chaos. He wants to pull others into that storm. But India refused, it didn't take the bait, and that's what made the entire moment so powerful. Trump's strategy is to provoke, get emotional reactions, paint opposition as unstable or weak. But how do you rattle someone who isn't playing your game? You don't. And in that moment, Trump was exposed not as the master tactician he pretends to be, but as someone who folds when the mirror doesn't flatter him back. And here's the twist that most people missed. India did use Trump's tactics, but it stripped them of arrogance and infused them with dignity. It took the idea of being unapologetic and wrapped it in self-respect, not self-obsession. It took the power of strong messaging, but aligned it with values, not vanity. And when that happens, when you show that strength doesn't require bluster, it's no longer just a comeback. It's a redefinition of power itself. The speech wasn't just for Trump. It was for every nation that's ever been talked down to. It was for every voice that's been silenced under the weight of Western exceptionalism. It said, without ever needing to scream, we see you, we hear you, we're not afraid of you. That is the kind of statement that rewrites narrative. That's how history pivots. Trump built a brand off of boldness, but boldness without truth is just noise. India showed that boldness with truth becomes thunder. It doesn't just echo, it shifts landscapes. And while Trump may continue to tweet, to taunt, to try and spin the story, the world saw something different this time. It saw a nation that didn't just speak, it revealed, it peeled back the mask. Because when you beat someone at their own game, but do it with integrity, you don't just win, you change the rules. There's something deeply powerful about being the one in the room who finally says what everyone else has been thinking, but didn't have the courage or the clarity to say. That's what India did. Not just for itself, but for every country that has watched the United States, under Trump especially, preach one thing and practice another. And it didn't come with venom. It came with focus, with directness, with a steady hand that pointed to the truth and said enough with the double standards. See, Trump loved to speak about democracy, freedom, sovereignty. Those words became his selling points, but only when they served him, only when they aligned with his narrative. If a country opposed him, suddenly it was corrupt or a threat. But if that same country helped him politically or financially, suddenly it became a friend, a partner, a beacon of freedom, even if it crushed dissent and silenced opposition at home. That's not diplomacy, that's convenience. India took that entire game and flipped the board. In one speech, they exposed the deep cracks in how Trump, and by extension much of American foreign policy under his administration, selectively chooses when to care about values. They asked the questions others were too cautious to voice. How can you talk about human rights violations in one country while praising another with far worse records just because they sign an arms deal? How can you champion press freedom, yet stand shoulder to shoulder with regimes that jail journalists just because they flatter you? This wasn't just criticism, it was accountability, because the world is tired. Tired of the lectures from those who break their own rules, tired of being told to follow standards that the West itself sidesteps whenever it suits them. And India, representing a rising collective voice from the global south, made that clear. They weren't pointing fingers to divide, they were holding up a mirror to demand honesty. What made it even more striking was how India managed to do it without sounding bitter or hostile. There was no anger, just an unshakable confidence in its position. A reminder that standing up for truth doesn't mean tearing others down, but it does mean no longer staying silent when injustice is hidden behind a flag or a suit. Trump, for all his bravado, didn't have a real answer to that. Because hypocrisy, when exposed calmly and publicly, doesn't leave room for defense. It only leaves silence. Think about the message that's sent to the rest of the world. It said, you can be powerful without being a puppet. You can speak up even if others try to shut you down. And yes, you can call out the so-called leaders of the free world when they're not living up to the values they claim to represent. That's not just bold, that's historic. And in that moment, India didn't just speak for itself. It became a voice for every country that's been labeled sanctioned or scolded by a superpower who refuses to look in the mirror. It gave language to the quiet frustration so many have felt watching the imbalance of accountability on the world stage. Because the truth is, leadership isn't about dominating the conversation, it's about elevating it. And Trump, for all his chest thumping and headline grabbing, was finally made to sit in the very spotlight he spent years using to shame others. What happened in that moment wasn't just a diplomatic statement. It was a moral one. It was a challenge to every leader who hides behind scripted values but bends them for personal gain. It was a statement that values mean nothing if they're not applied universally. India reminded us that integrity has no favorites. And when applied fairly, it doesn't just expose hypocrisy, it dissolves it, because the loudest voice in the room isn't always the strongest. Sometimes it's the one that speaks the truth without flinching and lets the silence afterward say the rest. There's a difference between being loud and being powerful, a difference between being heard and being respected. And in a world that often mistakes volume for value, that difference becomes even more important. That's what made this moment so defining. India didn't just speak, it demonstrated what true leadership looks like in the face of performative chaos. Because while Donald Trump has always relied on spectacle to sell strength, India chose a different path, one of quiet authority backed by truth, history, and principle. When Trump steps onto a stage, he brings with him an energy that's designed to dominate, tweets flying, headlines screaming, and distractions multiplying. It's not diplomacy, it's theater. It's less about the message and more about the noise. But the problem with that kind of leadership is that it burns fast and fades quicker. It may grab attention, but it rarely holds trust. It shocks the system, but doesn't strengthen it. India, on the other hand, walked into the global arena without the theatrics. No circus, no chaos, just calm reasoning and unwavering clarity. It was a performance without the performance. And in doing so, it held a mirror to Trump's style, not by mimicking it, but by contrasting it. India didn't need to raise its voice because its foundation was stronger. It didn't need to bully or distract because its message was focused. And when you watch that side by side with Trump's bluster, the truth becomes hard to ignore. That's what real strength looks like. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that commands it. And while Trump has made a career out of saying whatever gets the loudest reaction, India chose words that meant something, words that couldn't be spun, mocked, or ignored. They were rooted in lived experience, in decades of development, in a democracy that doesn't collapse when questioned. That kind of leadership doesn't need applause to validate itself. It simply stands tall and lets the world catch up. Trump built his image on being disruptive, on shaking things up. But disruption without direction is just destruction. What India showed was that leadership doesn't have to come at the cost of dignity. That being firm doesn't mean being cruel. And that making a point doesn't mean making a scene. In fact, the most dangerous thing you can do to a man who thrives on attention is take away the spectacle. That's exactly what happened. India didn't play into Trump's performance. It dismantled it piece by piece, using truth as its only tool. And that hit harder than any insult ever could, because deep down, everyone watching could see the contrast. One side relied on volume, the other relied on values. One side leaned on emotion, the other leaned on evidence. And in that contrast, Trump's version of leadership was stripped of its illusion. When you take away the crowd, the cameras, the chaos, what remains is the character. And that's where the difference was most obvious. People often confuse presence with power. But what India reminded the world is that the most powerful presence is the one that remains calm under fire, the one that refuses to be dragged down by drama, the one that doesn't need to fight dirty because its position is already clean. And when that kind of presence walks into the room, it doesn't need to say, I'm in charge. Everyone just knows. And here's what makes it even more inspiring. This wasn't just a message to Trump. It was a message to every leader, every young voice, every nation that's been told they have to shout to be taken seriously. India proved that intelligence, integrity, and impact are louder than any microphone, that you can lead without losing yourself. That truth, spoken with calm conviction, can silence even the loudest lies. So the next time someone tells you leadership is about making noise, remind them of this moment. Remind them that real power doesn't perform, it prevails. This wasn't just about a clash of personalities. This was about a shift in power, a global recalibration of who gets to speak, who gets to lead, and who gets to shape the narrative. For decades, the story of global leadership has been written in one voice, from one perspective, often dressed in Western ideals and American exceptionalism. But this moment, this stance by India, wasn't just a rebuttal to Trump. It was a statement to the entire world. The East is not just participating anymore, it's leading. See, Trump represents an old model, a model of dominance, of control, of forcing influence through pressure and intimidation. It's a model that's been glorified for too long. But what India brought to the table wasn't just a counterpunch. It was a new blueprint, one grounded not in volume, but in vision, not in manipulation, but in momentum. While Trump continues to speak the language of the past, India is building the vocabulary of the future. And that future isn't about controlling others. It's about elevating everyone. You could feel the shift. It wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. It was in the way India presented itself. Confident, not arrogant. Bold, not brash. And above all, inclusive, not entitled. It wasn't just advocating for itself. It was representing a broader movement, the voice of emerging economies. The aspirations of billions who've long been treated like silent spectators in global decisions. For years, these voices were present but not prioritized. Now, they're not just speaking, they're being heard. This wasn't an accident. This was the result of deliberate growth, technological advancement, economic resilience, diplomatic maturity. India's rise isn't sudden, it's strategic. And unlike Trump, who often rides waves of popularity based on emotional rhetoric, India's authority is built on consistency, relationships, and results. It's not trying to dominate the stage. It's just showing that it belongs there, and that changes everything. Because when one nation rises with integrity, it invites others to do the same. That's the power of representation. What India did wasn't just defend its own position. It gave other nations permission to believe in theirs. Countries that have been on the receiving end of condescending diplomacy, of conditional partnerships, now see a path forward, a path where strength doesn't mean sacrificing self-respect, where leadership isn't earned by obedience but by originality. Trump's idea of leadership was about making others feel small so he could feel big. But India showed that you can be big by making others feel seen. That's what the West is now having to confront. That leadership isn't a birthright. It's not inherited through military might or financial dominance. It's earned by how you treat others when you're in power. And when India spoke, the world didn't just listen, they reflected, because it touched something deeper than politics. It reminded us that fairness and dignity still matter. And this is why it landed so hard. Trump didn't just get challenged, he got outdated. His style, his message, his worldview, it felt stale in comparison to India's forward-looking clarity. This wasn't just about foreign policy or global alliances. It was about a cultural pivot, from exploitation to cooperation, from fear to respect, from spotlight politics to shared progress. That shift is what makes this moment historic. It's not just a clash, it's a transition, from a world led by those who shout the loudest to one shaped by those who stand the tallest. And in that transition, India is no longer the subject of global decisions. It's a co-author, a contributor to the collective voice of tomorrow. So yes, India challenged Trump, but more importantly, it redefined what strength looks like. And in doing so, it reminded every corner of the world that the future doesn't belong to the loud, it belongs to the ready. What made this moment truly unforgettable wasn't just what India said, it was how the world reacted. You could feel the shift, not only in the room, but across borders, languages, and ideologies. It was more than applause, it was recognition, it was relief, it was a silent cheer from millions who've been waiting for anyone to say what they've long felt but couldn't say themselves. India didn't just speak for itself, it spoke for the silence, the sideline, the second guest. And in doing so, it resonated on a frequency far beyond politics. Because when hypocrisy is so normalized, so deeply embedded in the global discourse, truth becomes revolutionary. What India did in that moment wasn't just diplomatic, it was deeply human. It touched the hearts of nations that have lived under the shadow of conditional friendships. Countries that have been threatened into trade deals, bullied into silence, lectured about democracy by those who don't practice it. They watched as India stood its ground, not with bitterness, but with clarity. And it lit something inside them, a sense of possibility, a sense of pride. This speech wasn't just about calling out Trump. It was about breaking a long-standing pattern of power imbalance, of watching leaders say one thing and do another, of watching values become bargaining chips. It was about confronting a system that too often punishes truth and rewards theatrics. And in that confrontation, India proved that dignity isn't a weakness. It's a weapon, a quiet one, but devastating when used with precision. And maybe that's why the speech traveled the way it did. It wasn't only being played in diplomatic halls or newsrooms. It was being shared in cafes, classrooms, village centers, places where people don't usually tune into international politics. But this wasn't just politics anymore. It had crossed over into something more universal. People weren't just analyzing it, they were feeling it. Because for once, someone had stood up, not just to Trump, but to the larger culture of arrogance that he represents. And they didn't stand up with fists. They stood up with facts. It's easy to think that only the superpowers hold the mic, that only the loudest voices shape history. But this proved otherwise. India didn't shout, it didn't insult, it didn't plead. It simply told the truth. And that truth echoed further than any insult ever could. Because when the truth is spoken with courage, it becomes contagious. Other nations start to believe they can speak up too. People start to believe they don't have to choose between pride and peace. And suddenly, the very structure that kept them quiet starts to crack. India wasn't just representing itself, it was symbolizing a much larger shift, a shift from dependence to independence, from appeasement to assertion, from being told what to valuing your own voice. That's what shook the world. Not the headline, not the soundbite, but the deeper message that said, you are allowed to speak, you are allowed to question, you are allowed to stand. And the timing couldn't have been more perfect, because globally people are tired of false promises, tired of seeing the powerful rewrite the rules to suit themselves, tired of being told that their pain must be measured, negotiated, or postponed. So when India stood up and calmly dismantled the hypocrisy it had endured, it didn't just represent resistance, it represented a roadmap. And it's that roadmap the world is now following. You can see it in the way smaller nations are beginning to negotiate differently, in how leaders are beginning to assert themselves without fear of being isolated. You can feel it in the way people are redefining what global respect actually looks like. It doesn't come from being loud or threatening. It comes from being consistent, from being fair, from standing on something real. Because when one nation dares to rise with truth, it lifts more than its own flag. It lifts the entire conversation.